Today, we are going to take a look at some potential early round busts to avoid. And I know, like I mentioned, everyone is going to hate this podcast, hate this episode, because we're talking about worst case scenarios for some of the more beloved players in all of fantasy football and in the NFL. But we need to be able to look at the other side of this coin. We need to be able to look at these players getting drafted in early rounds and say, what is the worst case scenario? How likely is that scenario? And can they sink our fantasy team if they don't return the phenomenal value that we need? Some names I mentioned from last year: Justin Jefferson, Austin Eckler, Stephon Diggs, Bijan Robinson, Nick Chubb, Cooper Kupp, all guys that were being drafted within the first 13 picks of fantasy drafts last year. I didn't even keep going to the second and third rounds. And those were all players that failed to return the fantasy value that we expected from them at their draft cost. So this is a real thing. This is something we do need to look at. Now, granted, it's hard. It's impossible to project injury. However, we can start to predict maybe usage, regression, things that we could see just simply change at the position. So we're going to take a look at the average draft position here early in July for some of these players and where we're ranking them, some players we might take instead. So Dave, the first player I know you want to talk about here is Sam LaPorta, and I could not agree more. The two of us have Sam LaPorta at tight end 3. He is the Football Guys consensus tight end 1. So you and I are both in lockstep, but we are behind consensus here at Football Guys. We're behind consensus in average draft position. He's going in the early third round here in July as the tight end 1. To me, this feels a lot like what I want to call starving man syndrome, is that we've just been wanting a really good rookie tight end for so long. And we've had some good ones. Kyle Pitts was good. Evan Ingram was good. But the best performance we really ever got out of a rookie tight end was tight end 5 in 2017 from Evan Ingram. Now we finally got elite production from Sam LaPorta, tight end 1 overall. And it just feels like we are really clinging on to that because we have wanted it for so long.
Yeah, and I think that's really what it comes down to is like people just getting blinded by what he did as a rookie. And for me, I mean, I could almost say this every single year. Like I just typically want to fade the top of a onesie position, whether it's a quarterback or a tight end. I never want to be the first person to take the tight end 1 off the board or the QB 1 off the board. It just very rarely works out that way outside of like the 5-year run we had from Travis Kelce. And for me, we've talked about it a lot this offseason. I think that there's a pretty flat group of tight ends near the top of the rankings. You've got Sam LaPorta, you got Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid, Trey McBride. And then a little bit later in drafts, you can get George Kittle, Kyle Pitts, Evan Ingram. And I know we kind of delude ourselves every single year into thinking that like tight end is deep, but what we saw last year is that it was kind of deep. And even towards the top, you look on a per game basis, Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, Sam LaPorta, and TJ Hawkinson were almost tied for their production on a per game basis. I mean, it was that close. And now here we are pushing LaPorta to the top of drafts. And he's a good player. Like he did a lot of really exciting things his rookie season. And I think that the hype is justified. But this just comes down to opportunity costs, and that's what we're going to talk about a lot on this show. It's not just like I hate Sam LaPorta, like I can't stand this guy on
Right.
a visceral level. That's not what I'm saying. But it's just that I can get these other tight ends later in drafts. So you look at the guys that are going in the same range right now as Sam LaPorta: Tank Dell, Michael Pittman, Zay Flowers, T. Higgins, George Pickens. If I can get one of those wide receivers instead of Sam LaPorta and then wait for the next round and pair up one of those wide receivers with a Travis Kelce or a Mark Andrews or a Dalton Kincaid, I just think that's a better way to construct your roster. Now, obviously, we know last year that what LaPorta did, finishes the overall tight end 1, was impressive, but I just am taking the under on 10 touchdowns, which is what he scored last year. If you look at his usage and his efficiency rates, he was, a middling tight end 1. He was 6th in target share. He was 5th in targets per route run. He was 6th in air yard share. It was the touchdowns that really propped up his fantasy production here. So really just what it comes down to is the opportunity cost, knowing that I can get a high-end wide receiver 2 instead of Sam LaPorta, and then probably get similar production from the tight end position a round or 2 later.
You capped it off perfectly there when you said you can get similar production a round or 2 later. I actually think like it can go even
Maybe
farther
better
than that.
production.
And yeah, like that's what I was gonna say here is, to me, a big indicator of a player who may not be worth their draft cost is when you can look down at the same position and say, Does the player, let's say tight end 6, George Kittle, going 3 rounds later, does he have the same potential to be tight end 1 or put up the same production that Sam LaPorta does?
Mhm.
Yes. And if I can draft that exact same player, at least production wise, potential wise, 3 rounds later, then the draft cost for a guy like Sam LaPorta is no good. And we've overdone it at that point. And I think that that's the overarching theme here. It's not that Sam LaPorta is not good at football because he's fantastic. He'll probably get plenty of opportunities and he's got a very safe floor. It's the fact that the cost has changed so much here. And that's more of the reason as to why we want to avoid this player early in drafts.
And the last thing I'll say about Sam Laporta, last year on a per game basis, we're looking at Mark Andrews, Evan Ingram, Sam Laporta, TJ Hawkinson, Travis Kelsey. They were all within 1 point per game of each other. And
Mm,
we kind of the reason we started drafting tight ends early is because of the huge advantage you were getting from Travis Kelsey, where Travis Kelsey was giving you a 5, 6 point advantage over any other tight end. But then Mark Andrews got up to speed. TJ Hawkinson was traded to Minnesota and really broke out. Now we've got this influx of Sam Laporta and Trey McBride and Dalton Kincaid, and all of a sudden that huge positional advantage that you were getting at tight end has evaporated. Like it's not there
mhm.
anymore. Like 75% of teams in a 12-team league are going to be getting pretty similar production from the tight end position. So you don't want to be the guy that completely kicks the can down the road and walks out of your draft with Tyler Conklin and Jonnu Smith. Like, could it happen? Sure, but it's probably not going to. So I think what you want to do is lock in one of these top 8 tight ends. And that's why I said 75%. Like 8 of 12 teams are going to walk away with a guy who has finishing as the tight end 1 in his range of outcomes. I would just rather take the risk on the cheaper guys than paying up for Sam Laporta.
Dang, man. Tyler Conklin just stays catching strays on the pod this
Back
week.
to back
That's
shows.
back to back. Can we make it next episode without saying something mean about Tyler Conklin? He's done nothing to us.
Yeah, our next episode is our quarterback show, and I will
Oh,
find
we're
a
going to talk
way
about
to
Aaron Rodgers. We're,
shoehorn
we're going to
a.
do it.
I'll find a way to shoehorn a Tyler Conklin compliment into our quarterbacks ranking show.
And I'm immediately going to erase it and say something awful. All right. Uh, Once again, I want to remind you guys, we got tons of ways that you can enjoy this podcast. First is here on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/at Football Guys Fantasy. Make sure if you're watching here, like this episode and subscribe to the channel. The videos come out the day before the audio podcast, so you can access these episodes earlier by subscribing to the YouTube channel. And then for those of you who are listening on the podcast, you already know there's an extra 10 to 15 minutes of bonus content at the beginning of the episode. So it's a good way for you guys to be both on YouTube and on the audio version of the show, so you can get a little bit of both. And then the big thing here is we've got our Listener League giveaway for the Football Guys Fantasy Football Show Listener League, exclusive to our YouTube subscribers. So the way you enter to be a winner for this, we're giving away one spot in the show's Listener League over the next 2 weeks here. You are going to comment below with the phrase, avoid the landmines. Okay, avoid the landmines is the secret phrase to put in the comments down below. Last episode, we had everyone chiming in. Arthur Smith is a good coach, and the comments were
They were
utterly
funny.
hilarious. It gave me so much entertainment for the rest of the day. All right, let's move on here. I want to talk about my first guy, and this one kind of pains me because it's a Miami Dolphins player, and I got to talk about Devon Achane as being a guy that I am very worried about. Dave, we each have Devon Achane, I think, pretty aptly ranked. I've got him at running back 15. You're at running back 17. Football Guys consensus is at running back 17. Football Guys in general is much lower on Devon Achane than the industry and where he's being drafted. Because right now he's being drafted as the running back 9 at the end of the second round. I mean, this one to me is the classic case of boom bust. He is genuinely going to make or break your team. And at where you're drafting him, how high you have to draft him, he really needs to return incredible value to be worth it. And honestly, just putting all of that into a nutshell, it scares the crap out of me. Like, if I'm just going to be real, Devon Achane, drafting him that early just terrifies me. He's had these injuries to his shoulder, toe, knees, ribs. He missed 6 games last year. And for those of us who are Dolphins fans like myself, watching the preseason games, you get excited. And I believe it was on his second carry. The dude got absolutely destroyed, goes down with an injury, and we don't see him back for a little while. He missed 6 games last season. I don't think we see this all that often where we look at a player who averaged 22% of the running back workload and say he's got to go in the first 2 rounds or he's got to go in the first 3 rounds. This is such a curious case because it's not something that we're really used to, where the offense is so good, the player is so efficient and so explosive, so talented. I don't truly know what to make of it. And I think it's because of having that sort of, I don't want to say, I guess, nebulous view on it and like not having a strong opinion of it. I'd rather stay away. This was a guy that he doubled his snaps and targets in losses. So we kind of
Hmm.
know he'll have some sort of uh, role in the passing game, but Miami likely won't be trailing in too many games. And so much of Achane's receiving work was because Tyreek Hill got injured, missed time. Jalen Waddle got injured, missed time. Even though it'll show in the stat sheet that they started the game and played, they would leave the games midway through. Then the Dolphins go, they add Odell Beckham Jr., they add Jonnu Smith, they draft Malik Washington. They went out and they got players that are going to be catching passes. They draft Jalen Wright, the running back out of Tennessee, who
That's the big
this one
one.
is, yeah, this is the big thing is that he's got a very similar skill set to Raheem Mostert. He fits perfect in this offense. And I think both of these guys, Mostert and Wright, are going to be taking the valuable red zone work that Devon Achane was getting. Devon Achane, for this little guy and the minimal amount of snaps he played, he had 11 touchdowns in 2024. 5 of those came from inside the 5 yard line. I don't think that's something that we're going to see a whole lot of next season, especially with the added playmakers, the rotation at the running back room. And I've mentioned this before when talking about Raheem Mostert. The Dolphins are going to want to keep everybody healthy because they need to be able to run the ball later in the season, especially when the weather gets worse. So I do envision a smaller role for Devon Achane, high efficiency. If he was going in fourth or fifth round, I'd be a lot more comfortable with it. But him going at the end of the second round is just way too rich for me. I'd rather take a guy like Travis Etienne just a couple picks later. Travis Kelsey's going 4 picks later. Isaiah Pacheco, even, who's going 5 picks later. These are all players that I know have guaranteed workloads. They have great ceilings. They're on good offenses. I'd much rather go in that direction, Dave.
Yeah, and I think again we're going to keep talking about ADP and opportunity cost, and um, I'm really interested to see where Devon Achan falls when we start doing more casual drafts. You know, right now, like especially on Underdog, it's crazy where Devon Achan is going, but that's because people are swinging for the high end range of outcomes, trying to beat 600,000 other entrants in a huge tournament. So I kind of get it, but like Devon Achan is a guy that I think we should be drafting in the third or fourth round because the downsides
Well, if
there, the
if we
upsides
look
there.
at if we look at ESPN and Yahoo drafts where there's a very small
Right.
handful, but those are going to be more of your people who are coming in for redraft. He is going in the mid third there. And so I don't know if you're more comfortable with that price. I don't even know if I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah, I mean, like mid third, early fourth, I'd probably be okay with it there. Um, but yeah, I mean, the risk is undeniable, and you talk about all of the additions to the Dolphins this offseason, but Jalen Wright is the one that really worries me because like there's absolutely a world where we can see Devon Achan limited to 6 to 8 touches per game, maybe 8 to 10 touches per game, but like he's never going to take on a huge workload. And it almost feels a lot like, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank right now. It was on the tip of my tongue. Who was that guy in Buffalo that we were drafting in the second round a few years back? Um, CJ Spiller, where CJ Spiller,
Okay.
like his
Yep.
rookie
Yep.
season, had like all of the super exciting efficiency metrics. We said, this guy, if his role grows just a little bit, he's going to break fantasy football. Then he spent the rest of his career in a very small satellite role and never really broke out in fantasy. So that is something to take notice of. The injuries are something to take notice of. He picked up preseason injuries, picked up multiple injuries in season. So there's a lot of risk with Devon Achan. All of that being said, we know the ceiling for Devon Achan is that he can drop a 50 burger on any given week. So, I mean, that's why
Right.
people are drafting him where he's going. But if he's spending a big chunk of the season watching from the bench with an ice pack on, that's not going to help you all that much. So if he's going in the third or fourth round, I think it's kind of fairly priced there. But if he starts to move up at all, yeah, I'm totally out.
All right. Well, let's go to our next player here. Chris Olave, Dave, is the guy that you want to talk about. And we're both pretty close on this. I've got Olave as my wide receiver 11. You've got him as the wide receiver 12. Football Guys consensus has him as wide receiver 12. Also, the ADP, average draft position for Chris Olave, mid to late second round, going as the wide receiver 11. This is interesting for me because this feels so much like the talks that we've had all offseason this year and last year. that we're worried about the ceiling for Chris Olave, and I guess it just begs the question: is does he have the same ceiling as other players getting drafted in that area? And if not, why would we be drafting him so early?
Yeah, and I'm looking right now. I'm actually a little bit lower on him than that. I haven't updated my rankings on Football Guys, but I've dropped him down to wide receiver 15. I've got Debo Samuel, Mike Evans, Brandon Ayuk,
Oh, you're
Nico
sick.
Collins ahead of him, and it's just it's tough because I really like Chris Olave. I was a big fan of him coming in as a prospect, and the big knock everybody had on Olave was that he was an older prospect. And I said, it doesn't matter. Like, go watch what this guy did at Ohio State. He's a very good wide receiver. He can do it all. But now we've seen him in the league for 2 years, and he and Derek Carr just cannot get on the same page. And I know the big selling points with Olave are the underlying metrics, the peripheral metrics, talking about the potential that could be if the chips fall where they should for Chris Olave. But even that, like, I'm just not seeing it. He was 12th in air yard share, he was 17th in target share, he was 18th in targets per route run, 20th in average depth of target, 21st in yards per route run, and last year on a per game basis, he was PPR's wide receiver 20. Like, that all sounds great for a guy that I could draft as my wide receiver 2 in round 3. But the problem is that's not where he's going. He's being drafted as a wide receiver 1 at the top of the second round, and that's all it comes down to for me again is opportunity cost. Like, we're drafting this guy as a wide receiver 1. He has never finished as a wide receiver 1. His peripheral metrics aren't that of a wide receiver 1. His peripheral metrics are that of a solid wide receiver 2, but we're drafting him above his floor and his ceiling right now. Like, even if he does hit his ADP, I don't think there's much of an opportunity for him to surpass it. I think that we're drafting him as close to his ceiling as he can possibly be. He's a good football player, but I just struggle to see the upside. And, I talked about some of the guys that I would prefer. But looking at drafts right now, there's a lot of guys going behind him that I would prefer outright. Brandon Ayuk, Nico Collins, Jalen Waddle, Debo Samuel, Mike Evans, Saquon Barkley, maybe even Devon Achane, who we just talked about. Like, depending on the team build that I have, like if I already have a solid wide receiver 1 that I drafted in round 1, when I get to the end of round 2 and I'm looking at Olave and Achane, I might even go Achane in that situation. It's just there's a lot of risk there, and I'm not seeing the ceiling outcome for Olave. Very talented player, but it really just comes down to me not being a huge fan of David Carr or Derek Carr. And maybe
Both of them.
maybe with Pete Carmichael being gone and Kubiak coming in there, we can see a huge change in offensive philosophy. But again, the guy running this offense is Derek Carr, and that's the big hang up for me.
So that's what I was going to say is that the Clint Kubiak entry into the offensive coordinator position there for New Orleans is the big selling point for me. This is the same guy that, ran things for the 49ers and allowed for the big breakout that we had been wanting from Brandon Ayuk. And I do think that Chris Olave big breakout is very possible, which is why I keep him ranked around wide receiver 11, wide receiver 12 in that area. Also, the departure of Michael Thomas allows for just tons of volume for Olave. And I think what we saw last year is just the efficiency was terrible on this. There were so many dropped passes, and from Olave as well. Like, it's not that it was just all bad throws from Carr. There were drop passes from Olave. There were bad throws from Carr. Hoping that another offseason of these two working together, getting into a better offense where there is going to be more motion for Olave to move across the field and get some easier routes, some easier targets, have Derek Carr using play action to free things up downfield and make the throws easier for himself. These are the things that's getting a little bit deeper into the football talk, but I still see that ceiling there. So this is, I think, the only guy in the show that I will push back a little bit, where I'm willing to take him where he's going. You know what? I'll do the caveat here. Probably not second round. Probably not second round where he's currently going. I don't want Chris Olave to be the second best player on my team. I'd rather take him in the third. I know it's like a really silly caveat to have, but I'd just rather be able to take him in the third.
So, I mean, some of the names that I mentioned, I just want to do like a, this or that type of guy. Like,
Yeah.
would you take Nico Collins ahead of Chris Olave? Do you have it ranked like
Uh,
that right now?
I wouldn't. I would take Chris Olave over Nico.
All right. Jalen Waddle.
I'm still going Olave over Waddle.
All right. Brandon Ayuk or Debo Samuel. I'll lump them together.
That's where it gets a lot tighter for me, and I think I would go Ayuk in that situation. I think
Especially
I
if he
think it would
gets
be
traded somewhere.
Yeah, well, even if he doesn't, I
Yeah.
love the safety of Ayuk in that offense, and we've seen the ceiling of Ayuk as well, so we know it's there. So I think I'd go Ayuk, Olave, Debo, but, like, back to back to back, like, all
Fair
very
enough.
tight,
Yeah.
so
And I
it's
think
not
that's
that
it. Like,
crazy for me.
you look at that whole tier, like, once you get I feel like there's a pretty significant fall off. I mean, there's multiple tiers throughout wide receiver rankings, but I feel like you have your first big drop off after 6, where you've got CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, AJ Brown, Justin Jefferson. That's kind of your clear-cut tier. All of these guys could finish as wide receiver
Yeah.
1. After that, Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua, Marvin Harrison Jr., Drake London. I feel like those are all guys that, like, we know are really talented. Can they take that step forward? And that's kind of what we're banking on in that tier. And then after that, I think that next tier of receivers, the names that we've been throwing around a lot when talking about Olave, Collins, Ayuk, Evans, Waddle, Debo, Olave, DJ Moore, Michael Pittman, Devontae Adams. It just feels so flat there. Like, it feels like all of those wide receivers have a very similar range of outcomes. So a lot of times when I'm looking at that point in the draft and seeing all those wide receivers there, I like Waddle, I like Nico, I like Ayuk, I like Debo, but I also find myself taking running backs there pretty often when it's Jonathan Taylor available or
Yeah,
Saquon Barkley. I find
agreed,
myself preferring the running backs in that range more than a lot of the wide receivers.
agreed, agreed, 100%. Okay, this next one is probably not going to be a fan favorite.
Dude, the energy level on this show is just
It's
so
sad,
low. It I
it's like
hate
we're at a
talking about
funeral
guys
right
to
now.
fade. Like,
We both wore black too, by the way.
I know, and we both wore collars. Like, who are we?
Unintentional. This
Freaking
is a very sad formal event for
yeah.
us. This sucks, man.
You
All
know,
right,
it's like it's fun gassing players up and being like, "This is the guy you gotta go out and draft." It's not fun saying,
yeah.
"Hey, these really good players going at the top of the draft might not be as good as you hoped."
Well, it's weird to spend, like, 45 minutes just worrying about what could go wrong. Like, it's the
Yeah.
Chicken Little episode where the sky's falling, we're sad about everything,
It's
but,
just like
I'll
starting my day off with anxiety, talking about everything that could potentially go
100%.
wrong on players that I have been drafting this offseason, and now the rest of my day is just gonna be like this anxious yeah.
Yeah. Big old thumbs down for this episode. But I'll do my best to present a decent case for this player. CJ Stroud, quarterback for the Houston Texans, and there's so much excitement about CJ Stroud as a player, so much excitement about the Texans, and it is warranted. I get that. I really loved CJ Stroud as a rookie. He was my quarterback 1 ahead of Bryce Young coming out of the draft. Loved what he was able to do with the Texans. But I think that the draft cost has kind of gotten out of control because of the hype that he and the team have gotten. Dave, you and I both have him as the quarterback 8. Football Guys consensus has him as the quarterback 7. However, right now, average draft position, that's fun to say, has him as the quarterback 5 going in the late 4th round. I do not see the ceiling there for CJ Stroud that warrants such a high draft pick. I love the Texans. I love Stroud. I think they're going to be better this year. I mean, things to consider. The defense is going to be better. The running game is going to be better. There's probably not as much reliance on CJ Stroud. It's just going to be how can we win games, not drop CJ Stroud back 45 times per game. The price on CJ Stroud and Stephon Diggs is just way too high. And I think it's just because there's so much excitement that keeps building and building and building. And we see this every year, the new shiny toy syndrome. When new players get added to teams, those offenses get steamed up all together. And this unchecked hype, it makes me very uneasy. You mentioned the anxiety of drafting a player early. This one would give me a lot of anxiety. I think he gives you a fine floor, but there are so many quarterbacks that also give you a fine floor for fantasy. To me, we don't get that high ceiling that you get of a rushing quarterback. Only 4 games as a top 10 fantasy quarterback last season. Little to no rushing upside. He averaged 11 rushing yards per game. There's a lot of quarterbacks that can do that. A lot of quarterbacks who can finish in the top 10 4 times in a season and give you 11 rushing yards per game. So if he is going to outperform this ADP, he is going to have to outperform last season by a very wide margin. Throw for a lot more yards, throw for a lot more touchdowns. To me, I feel like his ceiling is no different than a guy like Dak Prescott, who had
Mhm.
7 finishes inside the top 3 last season and Dak can be drafted 3 rounds later, that tells me everything. It goes back to the same thing I mentioned before. If there's a player at the same position that has a similar ceiling and similar floor that I can draft 2, 3, even 4 rounds later, then this tells me that the draft markup, that cost for CJ Stroud is totally incorrect right now.
Yeah, and of course, like the upside case for CJ Stroud is that he takes a huge step forward as a passer and he throws for 40 plus touchdowns, which is possible. And,
It
it's in
is.
his range of outcomes and it's in Joe Burrow's range of outcomes and it's in Dak Prescott's range of outcomes. And I think that that's why they're all accurately kind of lumped together. But I find myself preferring Dak out of that tier because he's the cheapest of the bunch. But yeah, Joe Burrow and CJ Stroud both fall into similar buckets for me as guys who need insane passing efficiency to pay off their ADP because they don't have any of that rushing to raise their floor and ceiling. So I often find myself passing on Burrow, Stroud, because later on in drafts, and I know I'm just like unfairly lumping Joe Burrow in here, but I think everything you said
But they're
about
going,
CJ
like, back
Stroud,
to back, and they're very
yeah,
similar.
exactly. Yeah, and I would just rather take my chances later on Jaden Daniels, who has the rushing upside, Jordan Love, who's going a lot later, Brock Purdy, who's going a lot later, Caleb Williams, who has this bit of unknown to his game. Tua Tagovailoa is a guy who, when you sit down and do projections, he projects very similarly to CJ Stroud, and he's going 5 rounds later. So CJ Stroud, I understand the case for the upside because he did this as a rookie and he could take a huge step forward. Now they've got Joe Mixon and now they've got Stephon Diggs, and it's a better offensive environment. But for him to pay off at his ADP, you need 40 plus touchdowns. And while it's possible, it's also far from guaranteed. And he is very easy to come up short of that.
You mentioned all those other quarterbacks going in later rounds that have similar upside, guys like Kyler Murray, who are going in the
Yeah.
6th round and has
I
a
always
higher
forget. I've got
upside.
him ranked so far ahead of CJ Stroud. I forgot about him because
He goes after.
exactly. Yeah. I always forget about that. Well,
Anthony
my
Richardson is
rankings,
going
not
after.
ADP. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
that's crazy to me. That is
yeah.
crazy to
He's
me.
going
Yeah.
he's on average, he's going 3 picks later than CJ Stroud.
Wow.
And even if we wanna get outside of that quarterback realm and talk about some other players, I'd love to grab Trey McBride in
Mhm.
that same round as a guy who has tight end 1 potential. I listen, we love CJ Stroud, we think he's a good player. It's a matter of how likely is he to reach that potential where he's going to be a top 3 fantasy quarterback and give you back the value on the draft cost. That's simply it. That's all we're doing here. That's why this episode is being done. It's to inform our audience of the risks that come with these players that are being drafted early. It's not all sunshine and rainbows for these guys. All right, Dave, let's go. We got to cheer up. Let's be happier. Let's make this a better episode. And if any of you need to go back and see some other happy episodes, go back and check out the previous ones. We had Chris Harris on, who told you don't draft rookies. We had Andy Barron's on, who sorry, that's not a good promo. Oh, we had Chris Harris on, who was phenomenal, gave us a very
Yes.
different insight to the way he's ranking players and how to understand the floors and ceilings of these players that he's ranking. Andy Barron's was on with us, JJ Zacharyson, and the guys from Player Profiler. We've had so many great guests. We have nearly 20 hours of fantasy football content over on the YouTube page, so go check that out. All right, Dave, let's keep the train of sadness going here. James Cook, running back for the Buffalo Bills, is a guy that you want to talk about. And it turns out I'm actually lower on James Cook than you are. I've got him at my running back 17. You've got him at running back 15. Football Guys consensus. This must be just Jeff Bell and all the other Bills fan staff writers we have just pushing this up because Football Guys consensus has James Cook as the running back 10. Right now, for average draft position, well, the consensus appears to agree with you, Dave. He's the running back 15 being drafted in the 4th round. That was where I said that I'd be comfortable drafting a guy like Devon Achane. So I'm
Right.
still not comfortable drafting James Cook this high. Talks about James Cook and what has you worried about him?
Yeah, and I've got him shown as my RB 16. So we'll talk after we're done airing and see because I'm a little bit lower on him, and he's a guy that I found myself passing on in a lot of early offseason drafts. Like you said, he's being drafted pretty much as a low end RB1, high end RB2, and that is just too high for me. I mean, there was a noticeable change after Ken Dorsey was fired last year and Joe Brady took over, and he saw some extra usage there, but the thing that concerns me most about James Cook is the addition of Ray Davis. And, people who are just tuning into
It's my
fantasy
boy.
content that kind of unplug for the offseason might be asking, who is Ray Davis? He is a rookie that the Bills drafted, and he fits the mold of a guy that they have been trying to implement into this offense. We've seen it over the years with Latavius Murray and Leonard Fournette and Damian Harris. They want a running back who can operate near the goal line and take the load off of Josh Allen. And last year, they had to resort to passing the ball to James Cook inside the red zone because they didn't have any legitimate running back threat who can do anything there. And they don't want Josh Allen taking those hits near the goal line. So I worry that we see Ray Davis carve out a pretty meaningful role in 2024, and that would render Cook into a passing back or a pass catching back, which is good. We like to see that, but it's not getting drafted as an RB1 good. It gives him a
I'll
high
say,
ceiling. Yeah. What?
yeah. No, no, I was gonna say this is like I'm not gonna get too hyperbolic on Ray Davis because I know I'm a huge believer. He's also a really good pass catcher. He
He
caught a
is.
ton of balls in college. So this is not just something where it's going to be a thunder lightning. It could be something where if James Cook isn't playing well or James Cook suffers an injury, it could actually become Ray Davis's backfield. That
Oh,
that
yeah.
worries me quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean the opportunity is sky high for Ray Davis, especially in the event of an injury. But you talk about opportunity. Last year, James Cook was 10th in the league in weighted opportunities, and wasn't extremely efficient. Like on a per opportunity touch, he was 30th in fantasy points per opportunity. So like he wasn't extremely efficient with the touches that he was getting, but he saw 291 touches last year, and that's why he was able to finish the year strong. But if you reel back that opportunity a bit and he maintains his same efficiency from last year, it would be awful for his fantasy outlook. So if he cedes some of the passing down work to Ray Davis, cedes all of the goal line work to Ray Davis, we're looking at a guy who's going to see a lot of low value touches between the 20s with the occasional targets here and there. And that's just not something that I want to pay up for as a top 12 running back. So again, comes down to opportunity costs here. I think James Cook is a fine player, but where he is getting drafted right now, it's just really, really hard for me to press that draft button with the other players that are going in that same range.
Yeah, I think this is a great call by you on this. There's some other players going in that range. Like Dave, let's play the game of this or that. Alvin Kamara or James Cook,
I have Alvin Kamara flat out ahead of Cook in my rankings.
Mark Andrews,
Well, Mark Andrews easily. Yep.
Anthony Richardson.
Anthony Richardson easily.
I mean, these are all guys that are going right after James Cook in
Yeah.
early drafts here.
I mean, even
And so
Chris Godwin, Keenan Allen, Hollywood Brown, Roma Dunze, like there's a lot of wide receivers that I prefer to James Cook as well. So it's just where he's getting we're drafting him based off of last year's what I believe to be unsustainable volume. Like last year, he saw a ton of opportunities and he saw a lot of valuable opportunities in the passing game and near the goal line. And I just can't see him falling into that same role now with Ray Davis there.
I think we just sort of stumbled into something that I think we've known, but now we can kind of put it into words. It's that the wide receivers that we're looking at as being safer plays, like you said, we can easily project their volume and easily project their usage. Whereas the running backs who get these explosive plays and get steamed up in average draft position next year and steamed up the rankings, so much of them have been put in these positions due to circumstance, whether it's another running back on the roster getting injured, which is exactly what happened to James Cook. Uh, we end up seeing these guys who they almost get this production when it's not planned. And I think like that is the crux of the zero RB drafter uh, blueprint right there is that we can't really project the volume for these running backs because all it takes is one injury, and all of a sudden, like you said, James Cook is getting unfathomable volume that we would not have seen or projected early on in the season.
But I think James Cook is also one of those like perfect examples of a guy who is hyper efficient in a smaller role. And then when that
Yes.
role grows,
Tony
the
Pollard.
efficiency falls off a cliff. I was just going to say Tony Pollard. And you look year one when James Cook was outside of the top 40 in weighted opportunities in a very minimal role, he led the league in breakaway run rate. And that's why people got so excited because 12% of his carries were going for 15 plus yards. Last year, on a much larger workload, that breakaway run
Say it
rate,
three times fast.
yeah, it's a tough one. That breakaway run rate dropped from 12% to 4%. He went from leading the league in breakaway run rate to being 26th in the league in breakaway run rate. And I think that a lot of people now are saying, well, he was super efficient as a rookie. And then in year two, he saw a ton of volume. And now, if he could just see that same volume and revert to the efficiency guy that he was as a rookie, he can break fantasy. But we know that's not how that happens. So, what most likely happens is that his efficiency sees a slight bump, his volume sees a slight dip. And I think that that just ends up, kind of falling into middling RB2 territory when he is splitting touches with Ray Davis. And that's my concern is that this guy's getting drafted to be an RB1. And I don't think that happens this year.
The podcast of perpetual sadness rolls on.
Who do you
And
hate,
this
Alfredo? Who are you going to talk about that you just
I
despise?
hate these guys. No, this is probably going to be the one that's going to get the most pushback, and I think rightfully so because I'll push back on myself as I talk about this player, and it's Justin Jefferson, the wide receiver for the Minnesota Vikings. I've got him ranked as my
Whoa.
wide receiver 5. I know. This is very
Whoa.
weird territory. Oh, shut up, Dave. You got him as your wide receiver 6. You got him ranked lower than me.
Yeah, no,
Shut
I
up.
completely agree with you. I just didn't want to be the one to say it. You're crazy. You're putting this out on
um,
YouTube for the people to comment on. Woo.
yes, that's right. Give us your angry comments. Do it. Football Guy's consensus has him as the wide receiver 3. And then average draft position, he is going as the wide receiver 4, 6th overall in the first round. And I think that we're doing this where he's getting drafted this high, Dave. It almost just seems like he becomes the de facto pick for people, where they say, okay, these guys, these other guys have the better ceiling and the better floor. But this is Justin Jefferson. We can't let him slide this far. He's just too good. And it's easy to make that argument. It's easy to make the argument that he is one of the best players in the league, if not the best player in the league. But he's going to be in a volatile situation with a rookie quarterback or just a bad quarterback. Like we don't quite know. They've got Sam Darnold and JJ McCarthy running the show over there. I get it. They still have Kevin O'Connell, but this Vikings offense could not just be bad, but they could be awful.
Mhm.
They've got an old running back in Aaron Jones. They're going to have TJ Hawkinson missing time. Uh, the offensive line has struggled over the past few years. The defense is getting better. Like this could end up being a run heavy team that's maybe not even good at running. Like we don't know what their identity is going to be. And that worries me, especially with a player that even as talented as he is, taking him with a top 6 pick is tough. It's tough to justify. You go back and you look at last season, Justin Jefferson, he played 4 games without Kirk Cousins. He was the wide receiver 20 in points per game. He had 3 finishes outside of the top 25 wide receivers in those games. And once again, this has nothing to do with his talent. It's about how volatile or bad the quarterback play could actually be. Because this was a guy who was getting a ton of volume. And I know that's going to be the argument for a lot of people. Well, he'll still get his targets. Sure. In these games, he was earning a 30% target share. And he was the wide receiver 62, the wide receiver 26. He had a boom game against the Detroit Lions where he was wide receiver 6, and then wide receiver 38. It didn't matter that he was getting volume because the offense, the quarterback play was so bad. And I know, Dave, we were supposed to embrace variance. I don't want to embrace this much variance with this early of a pick in my fantasy football drafts. I'd rather go with the guys who are going directly after him in the first round: Amon-Ra St. Brown, Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall. I can even be talked into taking AJ Brown over Justin Jefferson at this point, and I don't think it's that crazy.
I have all 4 of those players ahead of Justin Jefferson. That's what I was going to say. I've got Amon St. Brown, AJ Brown, Brees Hall, Bijan Robinson. I'll take all those guys ahead of Justin Jefferson. And of course, maybe Sam Darnold is good, but I'm not willing to say that. um,
The way he said, maybe he's good.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen what Sam Darnold is at this point. Like, I think that he can run an offense. I don't think that he's like terrible, but yeah, I mean, it's just impossible to say how negatively it's going to impact Justin Jefferson not having Kirk Cousins there. And
Yeah.
Justin Jefferson's still a talented receiver, and that's why we have him still going inside the first round, despite these quarterback concerns. But like, we know Amon St. Brown gets it done with Jared Goff. We know that AJ Brown gets it done with Jalen Hurts. So why would I risk taking Justin Jefferson ahead of these guys, knowing that we've seen multiple years of production from other wide receivers going into the same situations that they've been productive in for the last few years? It's just I can't do it. And of course, we could have egg all over our face. Who knows? Maybe Justin Jefferson just takes over, and it doesn't matter who's throwing the ball to him, and he finishes the wide receiver 1 again. It could happen, but I would just prefer to bet, like we said at the top of the show when we were talking in the podcast, the audio only version at the top of the show. You can really lose your league with your early round picks. And maybe Justin Jefferson does have a slightly higher ceiling than Amon St. Brown and AJ Brown, but those guys are so much safer, in my opinion, that I'd rather invest in the safe assets in the first round than swing for the fences with Justin Jefferson.
There it is, folks. You heard it. Dave Kluge is scared of the risk in the first round. All right,
Uh,
let's go to our next player here. It's another wide receiver. Uh, Once again, it's going to be a shocking name. This is a wide receiver who had a phenomenal year last year. And Dave, you want to talk about Puka Nacua? I've got him as the wide receiver 7. You've got him as the wide receiver 8. Football Guys consensus is at wide receiver 6. Right now, average draft position is 10th overall, wide receiver 7. So, you know, this is the guy to give everybody the behind the scenes. As we were getting ready to start this, you're like, I don't know how I feel about this one anymore, because you start to dig in and you say, like, man, he could just easily just be as good as he was last year.
Right.
So elaborate on that a little bit, because this is not just the episode where we sit here and say, man, this guy's bad, man, avoid him. We want to give some nuance. We want to give some real deep opinion on this.
Yeah, and it's not just saying like don't draft these players and
Except the
because
thumbnail will say that. The thumbnail will say don't do it.
yeah,
But then
like a
we
peek behind
offer
the
some
curtain.
smarter.
We need you guys to click this video. Like if we just say like, "Hey, these guys potentially might not be very great, and maybe you should think twice before drafting them," nobody's going to click on that video. So yeah, we got to
Oh my
we need to evoke that emotional response, and we do that with our titles and our thumbnails. But once you click on the show, we are level headed and reasonable, and that's what we do
sometimes.
here. And like, I don't want to be the guy saying like, don't draft the guy who just set the rookie receiving record. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't draft him, but the whole point of this show is trying to identify potential landmines early in drafts. And right now, Puka Nacua is a guy who could hit his ADP, could even potentially surpass his ADP, but also has a little bit more downside than I think that we're willing to admit right now. This is very clearly just a 1A and a 1B situation. And if you look at all of the reports coming out of the Rams beat right now, that's what they're saying is that Cooper Kupp is still there. Like Cooper Kupp was hurt last year and was dealing with a hamstring injury and missed some games and was limited in other games, but he is apparently healthy now. And we know that Cooper Kupp isn't a guy whose game is predicated on athleticism. He is just, he's got a great connection with Matthew Stafford. He's great at getting open immediately off the line. He can run those crossers. And we know that his skill set pairs very well with Matthew Stafford. And I think that there's this misconception that Puka Nacua just took over as the wide receiver 1 in Los Angeles. But if you look last year, like in the games that they played together, Puka Nacua had 100 targets. Cooper Kupp had 99 targets. Like they were getting almost identical usage, but the valuable targets, the ones inside the red zone, that's where Kupp was still the preferred guy. He had more targets, he had more receptions, he had more yards, he had more touchdowns, he had a better catch rate. And then when you start looking at Cooper Kupp last year, he had a few like uncharacteristic plays that you don't typically see from Cooper Kupp, where he was running the wrong route and he wasn't on the same page as Matthew Stafford, or Stafford was sailing the ball over his head when he was open deep downfield. A few of those uncharacteristically bad plays from Cooper Kupp, if those just fall favorably in his direction, then all of a sudden we're still talking about Cooper Kupp as, maybe a first or second round pick. But last year was there's no other way to spin it besides saying that it was just a disappointing year for Cooper Kupp, but it's possible that he can bounce back. Now, I looked at fantasy points. They do this first read data, which I think is really awesome. Like,
Mhm.
who are they drawing up plays for to get the ball to? And last year, the same thing in these games that they played together, Cooper Kupp had more of a first read share than Puka Nacua did. So this just comes down to why would I want to take the risk in drafting Puka Nacua in round 1 when I could draft Cooper Kupp in round 3 or 4 and he realistically has similar upside. I talked about Cooper Kupp recently on the show when we were talking about safe players to draft. And of course, the unsafe part about Cooper Kupp is that he could get injured again and maybe he just continues to fall off the age cliff and these injuries start to pile up. But there's also a very real world where Cooper Kupp is the 1A, Puka Nacua is the 1B, and it ends up being that you got the better receiver 3 rounds later. So I like Puka Nacua. He's a very good player. We even saw development as his season progressed. But right now in drafts, I'll take AJ Brown ahead of Puka Nacua pretty easily. I think ADP has reflected that change now, but that's what I've been saying for the last couple of months. And Jameer Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor are other guys that I think that you can potentially take ahead of Puka Nacua. For me, he's in that same tier as, like I said, Garrett Wilson, Drake London, Marvin Harrison Jr., guys that we know are talented, but there are some red flags in their profiles.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier how wide receivers have been easy to project, and running backs have been these players that when they get volume, they seem to be these uh, pleasant victims of circumstance where someone around them gets injured, and that's kind of what happened with Puka,
Yeah.
with Cooper Cup not being in there, and we go and look at his first 2 weeks. 20 targets in week 2, 15 targets in week 1. You've got a guy getting 35 targets over the span of 2 games. Absolutely nuts. And then you start to see as the rest of the season goes on, those target numbers do get a little more deflated. You're looking at closer to 7 or 8 targets a game, 4 or 5 receptions per game. There was some great efficiency with touchdowns. It was great efficiency with yards after the catch. But we also saw that there was a streak of games there from week 6 to week 12. He was averaging 11 and a half points per game. It wasn't quite the same. This was a guy getting a little bit over 4 catches per game, 58 yards. I know I'm just rambling off a bunch of numbers here, but it is important to show that there's a floor here. And the case you presented about Cooper Kupp being the 1A is extremely realistic. And it's very human of us to always want to remember the good times and remember the highlights and, kind of forget some of these lowlights or remember what have you done for me lately. And I think that's what we are doing a bit with Puka Nacua. I still think there's a good ceiling for him. I still think there's a good
Yeah,
floor for him. I still
and
think
that's
he's
the
an
thing. I
incredibly
mean,
talented player.
and that's why I was weary. I mean, again, a peek behind the curtain, like Alfredo, you and I, like we swapped out multiple players we want to talk about.
Mhm.
Realistically, if I wanted to talk about a fourth guy on the show instead of Puka Nacua, it would have been Devontae Adams. But I just talked about Devontae Adams 2 episodes ago when we were talking about players with huge downside. Devontae Adams is a guy that I'm really fading in this range, but the upside case for Puka Nacua, I just want to put it out there. Like he could be a 2,000 yard receiver. Like from what we saw
Yeah,
last year, the upside is absolutely there. But
he can be the
this
wide receiver
show,
one.
yeah, but this show we're focusing on the downside. And I think when you start looking at all of the wide receivers going in round one, the 2 guys that I see that have non-injury related downside are Justin Jefferson, who you talked about, and Puka Nacua, who I talked about. I think all of the other wide receivers going in round one are relatively safe, assuming they stay healthy. But Puka and Justin Jefferson are the 2 guys that could stay healthy for the entire season and still finish as, more of a middling wide receiver 2 than the wide receiver 1 they were drafted to be.
All right, you're sitting at pick 9 in your first round. Justin Jefferson, Puka Nacua, and Garrett Wilson are all on the board. Who are you picking?
I'm going Justin Jefferson there,
All right.
just because of the upside. But yeah, that's not a spot that I found myself in often. But I'd
I think we
probably
found
go with
the
Justin
worst spot of
Jefferson.
the draft.
Yeah, yeah, and all of those guys have upside. All of them have downside, but I think I'd lean towards Jefferson. I've got him. Looking at my rankings right now, I have Justin Jefferson 2 spots ahead of Puka Nacua. I've got Garrett Wilson making a little sandwich in between Justin Jefferson and Puka Nacua in my rankings.
Well, we're going to keep talking about this Rams offense because I'm going to do what basically every audience member hates that we do. And Dave, you've done it a couple times. I've done it once before. I'm going to talk about the worries of rostering Kyren Williams, Rams running back. I've got him as my running back 9. Dave, you can correct me on this. I believe you have him as running back 8. Football Guys consensus is also running back 8. Right now, average draft position is running back 7, going in the middle of the second round.
Mm-hmm.
My issue here is I don't want to have to pay up for him. We've got a guy with I think we can get past the the late draft capital thing because he has produced in the NFL like a star. But we've got a small guy with an injury history very similar to Devon Achane. We have seen a new leading rusher in Sean McVay's offense each of the last 5 seasons. Drafting Blake Corum for the Rams in the 3rd round should absolutely be sounding alarms for fantasy football managers.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that we wanted to say, don't worry about it. Kyron's really good. Sean McVay loves to give one running back the bulk of the carries. Kyren was at or near 80% of the running back snaps in 10 of his 12 games played last season. He led the league in snaps. The Rams simply just didn't have anyone else. Their only other backup was Ronnie Rivers, or when they re-signed Darrell Henderson, and all these guys kept getting hurt, and there was just no one in the backfield.
Oh, you're just going to
So
pretend like Zach Evans doesn't exist? Come
he
on,
doesn't.
Alfredo.
He doesn't. Sean McVay doesn't believe he exists either. Zach Evans is the tooth fairy to Sean McVay. Like, that's who he is. this is something where I don't think it's necessarily a guy who is going to Blake Corum. I mean, is not just going to be a guy that comes in and takes over from Kyren Williams, but he is going to be an insurance policy. He is going to be a guy that's going to take some meaningful snaps and some meaningful drives potentially. We saw what happened a few years back when Sean McVay had a workhorse running back in Todd Gurley. There was multiple seasons back to back of running back one overall fantasy production, but it started to wear down his body. And then when the Rams decided they wanted to keep Gurley healthy for the season and limit his workload some, Todd Gurley dropped to the running back 14 in fantasy. He lost
Mhm.
about 6 opportunities per game. Some of those came in the passing game. Blake Corum is a guy who is very good in pass blocking situations. He is a guy that is very good around the goal line. He's similar to Kyren, but there are things that he does better. So I do think we're going to see Blake Corum get involved quite a bit, especially near that goal line where Kyren had 15 total touchdowns last season. And this is interesting to point out because I know it's always kind of sharp to bet on touchdown regression, but this hits a little differently because with Kyren, 13 of his 15 touchdowns came from within the 10-yard line. This was not a guy who was making big explosive plays from deep down the field for the Rams. This was the Rams getting in close, and they either did not have Cooper Kupp available, they did not have another option at running back available, and they were getting the ball into Kyren Williams' hands. Now, you could use the other side of that argument and say, well, they're giving him the ball because they trust him because he's talented and they'll do the same thing. They absolutely could. I'm saying I don't want to buy into that risk of Blake Corum, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, all being the guys that get the touches down by the goal line, especially when 70%, 77% of these touchdowns he got were from inside the 5. That's where I think Blake Corum is really going to start to cook and take away some of those Kyren Williams touchdowns. So, Dave, I can't find myself drafting Kyren Williams where he's going. I do tend to lean more towards Derrick Henry, who I rank ahead of
Oh,
Kyren
yeah.
Williams, especially on that Ravens offense. I start to consider Isaiah Pacheco over him in that same range. I'm not quite there yet, but I can be sold on it. And honestly, I just tend to look more towards the wide receivers in that range: Drake London, Mike Evans, guys that I think could really just surpass what Kyren Williams has the potential to do next season.
Yeah, Kyren Williams is one of the most interesting guys to talk about this offseason, obviously because of the addition of Blake Corum. And like what we saw last year, like that's not what Kyren Williams was drafted to be. Like you talked about it. He's an undersized guy, doesn't have, a huge build or anything like that. And his skill set at Notre Dame, what we saw him do best was in the passing game, where he would kind of get out there in space and catch passes. And that was kind of the upside case with Kyren Williams when we were talking about him as a prospect, is like maybe he can be like an early career Austin Eckler or a James White, a guy that just gobbles up a ton of catches. And then last year, he was like forced into this power back role where he was running between the tackles and he was, kind of keeping the chains moving. And I don't think anybody expected that. Like if you watch Kyron Williams play at Notre Dame and then saw what he did in college, you'd have to like rub your eyes and make sure you were looking at the same player, because it was just completely different skill set than what we saw during his time in college. And then in steps Blake Corum, who is a power back. Like that's what he does best, is run between the tackles and take the goal line touches. And well, he can get going a little bit as a pass blocker. He's not an exceptional pass catcher. So in almost any other team, like if this running back duo of Blake Corum and Kyron Williams was on 31 different NFL teams, I'd say, well, this is pretty easy to project. Blake Corum is going to get the early down work. Kyron Williams will come in as the third down and passing down running back. But knowing Sean McVay's tendencies that we've seen over the year, he likes to lean heavily on one running back. So we're looking at two guys that have very complementary skill sets, but we have a coach that has a historical tendency to lean on one guy. So it's really tough for me to project how this goes, because maybe Sean McVay bucks this trend that we've seen in previous years, realizes that he has two guys that can do two different things, and finally deploys a two back committee. Or maybe Kyron Williams maintains his role from last year. Or maybe Blake Corum steps in and takes the Kyron Williams role. Like there's so many ways that this could potentially shake out. Really, it just comes down to being Kyren Williams going in round 2 and 3, Blake Corum going in rounds 11 and 12. Give me Blake Corum, who has the same upside as Kyren Williams and can be drafted so much later. Oh, Alfredo, you got me on the last episode. I got
Oh
you on this
my
one. We are
gosh.
slipping, man. We were
Muted.
professionals, and now here we are going into our 100 teens episode and
100
just falling
teens.
apart. falling apart here.
Yeah, yeah, this is what happens. You get a little too big for your britches and you keep yourself on mute. What I was saying is that
You
when
were
it comes
saying that
to
I eloquently made an amazing point, and you agree with everything I said.
that's our
I read your
show. We'll
lips. I
see you
read your
later.
lips. Yeah.
Yeah. Listen, we could absolutely be wrong. Like we could absolutely be wrong about this. And the fantasy industry has done this from time to time where we see, okay, the Seahawks drafted Zach Charbonnet. That's the end of Ken Walker. The Jaguars drafted Tank Bigsby with good draft capital. That's the end of Travis Etienne. And so sometimes just looking at a player and say, okay, they added a running back, that should scare you off. Sometimes just saying that is wrong. And the current starter is better than the potential incumbent. Uh, Listen, guys, it's one of those things where this episode is all about risk assessment, not necessarily talent evaluation. And I probably shouldn't have waited till about like the hour mark to say that, but I think we've done an eloquent enough job of explaining the nuance of this conversation here, where almost every single time we brought up a player's name, we didn't say, well, he sucks at football. We said he's a really good player, but we're worried about XYZ. And I think that argument remains the same for Kyren Williams. And I don't think, I hope that people don't hear what we're not saying, is what I'm getting at here, Dave.
I hope they do, and I hope that you know that Alfredo hates Kyren Williams, and sound
There it
off in the
is.
comments and
There it
let
is.
him know what a fool he is for saying that he wouldn't draft Kyren Williams if he fell to the 18th round.
There it is.
That's what I heard you say,
Thanks.
Alfredo.
Thanks, pal. Thanks, pal.
Well,
Well, the
we'll be back
podcast of,
next week's gonna be a lot more. We
I
got
was going to
rankings
say,
week coming
yep.
up, and that's gonna be a lot more positive.
Yeah, the podcast of Perpetual Sadness is over. We
Whew.
are going to be kicking off rankings week with our top 24 quarterback rankings and tiers. That episode is going to release on Friday. The podcast audio side goes up the next morning. We're going to be going through all of our rankings the very next week on the show. So running backs, top 48 running backs, top 48 wide receivers, top 24 tight ends. We're going deeper and deeper on these rankings, phrasing. And listen, I think it's going to be fun because I think there's going to be a lot more optimism with those episodes. Okay, no wearing black next week. How about that, Dave? We'll make it a rule.
Yeah, I will wear my brightest shirt on Friday. Don't worry.
Happiness, sunshine, fantasy football, all good things. As always, thank you to everybody for watching and listening all the way through. Be sure to subscribe to the daily news updates from Football Guys. You get everything you need for your fantasy football league sent straight to you every day by Joe Bryant himself. For me, for everyone at Football Guys, for Dave Kluge, for our production team, for everybody, I want to thank you guys for watching and listening. We'll see you next time. Adios.